Hi, I'm Tony McMahon and I've got a question for you. Do you believe in witches? There is definitely increased interest in witchcraft, in folklore, in the occult. And I was in a bookshop, for example, on Saturday, Treadwell's in London. There's a big witchcraft section and there were a lot of young people gathered around those books, reading them feverishly. So witchcraft is back in fashion. What I want to talk about today is the part of England where I grew up, where there's always been a strong tradition of witchcraft, and that is the county of Essex. Now, you might not be able to tell from my accent that I grew up in Essex, but I did, in Woodford to be exact, but I know Essex very well. And it's a county that's often mocked and reviled by people outside of Essex, but it's a place that's got huge amounts of history, Saxon, Norman, Roman, you name it. And it's also got some incredible witch stories. In the middle of the 17th century, we would have found ourselves in the middle of the witch hunting mania, which kind of kicked off gradually from the 15th century, but really got going in the 17th century. And as we saw the wave of puritanical Christianity, the reign of Oliver Cromwell, and a great deal of instability in England, there was a kind of witch hunting mania that reached a fever pitch during the middle of the 17th century. And a man who found himself at the centre of all this was Matthew Hopkins. Now, in my view, he was a kind of a failed lawyer, a mediocre lawyer, but he reinvented himself as the self-styled Witchfinder General. He was born in Manningtree in Essex, and what he did was basically claim to villages and towns across Essex and East Anglia that he could sniff out witches. He could identify them, and then having identified them, he would question them, often torturing them, and then pronounce whether they were innocent or guilty. If they were guilty, they were normally hanged, though the punishment for witches was often being burned at the stake, one of the most gruesome forms of execution. One of the most notorious episodes in the activities of Matthew Hopkins was at Chelmsford. Now, if you go to Chelmsford today, it's a pretty innocuous town in Essex. You'd go there to do your shopping or something. But in 1645, Hopkins and his associate John Stern came to Chelmsford and accused an astonishing 23 women of being witches, and they were all put on trial. And Hopkins, overseeing this trial, consulted his own manual, The Discovery of Witches, where he claimed that he had a methodology for rooting out witches, for confirming which women were witches or not. 19 out of these 23 women were hanged. The other 4 died in prison of what was described as jail fever, most likely typhoid. I mean, prisons were absolutely rife with disease at this time. The hysteria that Hopkins generated in Chelmsford foreshadowed what would happen at Salem, Massachusetts, in America several decades later. In that sense, Hopkins was a trailblazer. There are some pretty exaggerated figures for the number of women in Essex who were hanged or executed in some other way on charges of witchcraft between 1648 and 1660. A figure as high as 3,000 has been given, but I think that might apply to the whole country, or it's just an exaggerated figure. But I think we can say with confidence that a lot of women were accused of witches and many were unjustly executed. Why were the good people of Essex so obsessed with hunting witches? Well, these were mainly rural, semi-rural folk, deeply religious, clutching their Bibles, puritanical. They were adhering to the Protestant faith, and they believed that the devil really was abroad the face of the earth. And Hopkins wasn't inventing something new. There had already been a witch hunting mania in Essex for decades, stretching back into the previous century. About 80 years before Hopkins embarked on his witch purges, the town of Great Dunmow had witnessed a very well reported trial. In 1567, Alice Prestbury was charged with bewitching Edward Parker, and at the Brentwood Assizes in March of that year she was found guilty. However, before she could be hanged or burned at the stake, Alice died of jail fever. Again, this was more than likely typhoid. And in a further sad twist to this tale, her husband John hanged himself a few weeks before his wife died. In 1589, Joan Prentice was hanged alongside two other women, also called Joan Cunney and Joan Upney, also in Chelmsford. Joan Prentice lived in poverty in the village of Sybil Headingham, near the town of Braintree. And with the benefit of hindsight, it was probably inadvisable for her to have a pet ferret called Satan that was used as evidence during the witch trial. This pet ferret was allowed to pinch her cheek with its teeth and draw blood, something that features in the illustration from the period. Some details of this trial are, well, almost funny if it wasn't for the fact that poor Joan was executed at the end of it. The description of the ferret, for example, is well worth repeating. In the testimony from the trial, it said that about 6 years passed between the feasts of All Saints and the birth of our Lord God. The devil appeared unto her, Joan that is, in the almshouse aforesaid about 10 of the clock in the night time, being in the shape and proportion of a dunnish coloured ferret, having fiery eyes, and the said examinate being alone in her chamber, and sitting upon a low stool, preparing herself to bedward, the ferret standing with his hinder legs upon the ground, and his forelegs settled upon her lap, and settling his hinder legs upon the ground, and his forelegs settled upon her lap, and settling his fiery eyes upon her eyes, spake and pronounced unto her these words following, namely, Joan Prentice, give me thy soul. In other words, the ferret, possessed by Satan, spoke to Joan and demanded her soul. And this was taken as serious testimony, good enough to have Joan executed. By the 18th century, most of England was rejecting the whole notion of witchcraft. And in fact, the Witchcraft Act in the 18th century put a stop to witch trials. However, in Essex, witchcraft continued and witch hunting continued. And if we go back to that village of Sybil Headingham that I mentioned a few moments ago, there was one of the last examples of a witch being hunted down and killed. In 1863, we hear about a local deaf and mute man in Sybil Headingham who was known rather insultingly as Dummy, and who made a living by fortune telling. Now, a woman called Emma Smith from a neighbouring village said that Dummy had cursed her and she wanted the curse lifted. And a mob, I suspect a drunken mob, listened to Emma's story and then ran down to a pub where they knew Dummy was drinking. I'm sorry I have to refer to him as Dummy, but we don't have his actual name, where Dummy was drinking, and they basically dragged him to a local river where they carried out a kind of trial by ordeal, an old-fashioned trial by ordeal, where he was lowered into the water and to see if he would drown, basically. If he didn't drown, the verdict was guilty. Anyway, at some point, this idiotic spectacle was stopped and Dummy was taken to a local workhouse to try and recover, instead of which he died of pneumonia. Those involved in this act of 19th century superstition were then arraigned before the Chelmsford Assizes, where they received 6 months hard labour. And then, incredibly, as late as 1880, we have a father and son, Charles and Peter Brewster, who claim that a woman, Susan Sharp, had been making their bed rock unnaturally. Think the movie The Exorcist and you'll get the picture. She'd been casting her own shadow on the walls of their house, and she'd killed their domestic pets using magic. Now, they wanted to put her to some kind of ordeal, but her husband went and appealed to the authorities to put an end to this stupidity. Luckily for Susan Sharp, she was alive in the 19th century and not the 17th century, and the courts forced the Brewsters to keep the peace, so they were punished and not Susan. She wasn't burned at the stake, hanged or anything else. Anyway, I don't know what it is about Essex, but there's this long association with witches. If any of you out there are from Essex or you're into witchcraft, do leave your comments below. I'm intrigued to know what you think about Essex and its witches. Until we meet again, thank you and goodbye.